Hello and welcome to reveal of spin number 2 of the fabric wheel of fate, and here it is. So I have this beautiful duck egg blue, it's maybe more of a pale blue than duck egg blue, but absolutely gorgeous pale blue, Sherwood's lawn, or lawn from Sherwood's. I don't know if it was a Marley Care lawn. It feels nice and fine. It feels very like their Marley Care lawn, and it was lovely to work with. I bought it as a remnant, oh gosh, I don't know, probably 5 years ago. And it's been sat in my stash ever since. So I've really enjoyed sewing it up. I've made the Cashmerette Haskell shirt, and it's a club pattern. I will put some photos up of it. It's a club pattern, it's a camp collar. It's quite a different method of making it. I've used the eggshell buttons, again I'll put a close-up, that I bought at the Festival of Quilts at the Uttoxeter Quilt Festival. I made it in a size 14, and I used the GH full bust section. It's an unusual shape. I'm very used to cashmerette and altering the patterns, so I did the usual inch in for moving the full bust down. I think that was a bit too much on this. I think maybe 3/4 of an inch might have been the perfect spot, but it's okay, it fits nicely. I did think when I was making it that it wasn't going to fit. I had lots of problems with the bust point, having too much fabric at the bust point, but they're quite an unusual dart. Not exactly a French dart, but not far off. And the instructions say that you can do a French seam on the dart, which I did, but that then stopped me from adjusting it quite as much. But it would have meant, because you end up with a raw edge rather than a traditional seam. So I've not done this type of dart before, and I just found it a little bit fiddly to get right, but I did get it right in the end. I'm really pleased with the fit. The fit is lovely now. It's probably a better fit than my Vernon shirt, I would say. Yeah, really good fit. So I did my usual 1/2 inch full bust adjustment on that, which is why this looks very messy. And yeah, oh, I also I didn't adjust it on the pattern, and I will adjust on the pattern. Because I have no hips, this area really kicked out and looked very silly. So I cut, before I put the binding on, I cut 6 centimetres off the length here and rounded it out, and that made it very difficult for me to bind it because it was such an acute angle. So I need to adjust it on here. I do like it without, I might be able to just get rid of that without actually having to chop the corner off, which will be better for next time, and I'm sure I will make it again. It has a very clever, the collar's really clever. You just make the back collar, it has no collar stand, you make the back collar section, and then the facings make the front collar, and it all goes together very cleverly, and you sew it round. So it was interesting to make that type of pattern that I'm not familiar with and haven't made before. And I found it quite a challenge in places. There is a sew along. I didn't actually look at the sew along. I just went by the instructions. The instructions are excellent for cashmerette club patterns. I had no difficulty following them. You know, I print them off as a booklet. If you have your patterns printed, you can have it A4 or A5, and you can have it in colour. If I'm doing them at home, I don't bother, I just do a little A5 booklet, and I usually stitch them together. So that's what I made, and it does tie up, and I have got some photographs of me wearing it earlier, and I will show you some of the ones with it tied up. But I think I need some, I just had some shorts on that sit on my hip, and I need to have a high waist trouser if I'm going to wear it tight, because I don't want my belly to show. It's not my best bit. Nobody needs to see that. That's scary. But I'm really pleased with it, and I've enjoyed making it. It has been quite a challenge. This has been lovely to work with, and I'm really pleased that my little eggshell buttons worked so well with the fabric. So there we go. That's my oh yes, and I also did, and I will tack on at the end of this video, I'll do the how to, well, I did the facing because last week or the week before I showed how to face facing, and I did it on here, so I just showed that briefly again. But I also showed how to make the binding, how to actually make bias binding if there are any beginners that have never made bias binding, and I know most of you will have done, but if you haven't, there's a bit of technique there, and then how to face use the binding to face the hem. And if I was making a big one of my big cotton skirt dresses, the 8577, I would hand stitch the hem up, but on this everything's top stitched, so I just top stitched the hem, but so it's not invisible, it's just top stitch. But on my big skirts it is invisible, and because of the way I do it, because you have to trim away quite a bit of the binding on this, and on my big skirts I don't, so I tend to have a slightly deeper facing, hem facing at the bottom. But yeah, really pleased with it. I like the back. The back has, if I just turn it around for you, the back has this lovely gathered section, which I don't have on any. I think this might be gathered at the back, this Rhapsody blouse that I'm wearing, but I don't have any other shirts with this gathered feature. And in this structured fabric, you get quite a nice poofy effect with that. The yoke is burritoed, so it's spotlessly clean inside. It's as good inside as it is out. Facings faced, the darts French seamed, the side seams are French seamed, and the facing, as I say, facing's edge, and then the hem is faced. So, and the facing, the collar is part of the facing, so it's all beautifully clean inside with the burritoed collar. No hand stitching involved anywhere. I did some hand basting. Where did I do that? No, I didn't hand baste. I machine basted something. I can't remember what. The collar, I think. Just machine basted it. I might have. No, did I machine baste the cuffs? The cuffs are nice. They're like the type of band you'd put on a t-shirt. You know, you make the cuff and then you stitch it on, and again that's all fully enclosed, so there's no, can't see any serging or overlocking or anything like that. It's nice inside as out. I really like that. I like that clean finish. I think in a drapier fabric it would be easier to get under the arm because it's a grown-on sleeve, and because the seam is French seamed. Under the arm it just doesn't sit as smoothly as it might do if I hadn't French seamed it. I did regret not being able to get that seam really smooth. It's just a little bit, it just puckers a little bit. There isn't any gathering in the seam. The seam is straight, it just doesn't quite lay flat because of the thickness of the French seam. That's the only thing I might not do that next time. Maybe just one run of overlock down the sides. I don't know though, it looks lovely inside. I think with the drapier fabric it would be fine. I think it's the fact that it's quite a structured fabric and it's a very tight curve, and because you don't have the set-in sleeves, you can't really avoid it. But yeah, I'll definitely make more. I enjoyed wearing it. I really like how it looks. It's a lovely, casual summer shirt. Yeah, I really like it. Yeah, very pleased. So a success. So on to the next spin of the Fabric Wheel of Fate without any more ado. Here we go. So I have my have it all set up here. I don't know if you can remember, we have 4 fabrics left. We have the floral fabric, which is a cotton sateen from Rainbow Fabrics. We have the lovely dark grey charcoal, and that's the Robert Kaufman washer linen. I think that's the blend, isn't it? Robert Kaufman linen. Then we have a linen viscose floral down here, navy, with then the beautiful white and grey flowers with a hint of yellow, and then this lovely deck chair stripe, and that is a rayon stripe, and the rayon stripe is yarn dyed rather than a print. Just okay, we're ready. Number 2, it's the deck chair stripe. Excellent. I'm not sure what made me put it all the way at the top of the shelf up there and not get it down. I didn't really want to get all 4 out, so I was waiting till I saw what the spin was. Yes, it's this lovely, it's another lovely shirting weight, but this time a summer rayon in this lovely deck chair stripe. Not quite sure how much I have. So I think there's a couple of meters. What do you think I should make with it? I will have bought it as a shirt, but there are other options, aren't there? Yeah, probably 2. It's nice and wide. It's nice and wide. It'll be 60 inches wide, and I've got approximately 2 meters in length, I think. Yeah, approximately 2 meters in length. What do you think I should make with it? And which way should the stripes go? And should I play around and have stripes going in different directions? Nice. Very nice. I shall have to think about that. It'll be lovely for the summer. I've been looking forward to sewing this up for some time. So yeah, that'll be lovely. Right, tell me what you think in the comments, please. What would you make with it? 2 meters of shirting weight rayon that is yarn dyed, and this lovely deck chair stripe. Yeah, probably not another one of these, maybe something different, but I don't know what. Da, da, da. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a lovely week, and I hope to see you for Friday sews. It might be a little bit late. We have visitors until Friday morning, so I'm not going to get any sewing done between now and Friday sews. Don't think. We'll see. But I have a fallback position, so something else to talk to you about on Friday. So we'll see. Hope you can join me then, and happy sewing. Bye bye. I thought you might like to see an actual real facing being finished in the way that I demonstrated recently on facing a facing. So here we go. So this is one that I've already completed. This is the facing for the Haskell shirt, which is a camp collar shirt, and the facing forms part of the collar. This part here forms part of the collar. So this is the inside facing, and you really, on a cotton lawn shirt, want to reduce the bulk as much as you can. So this method gives you a very nice fine edge without any weight. There's no edge stitching on there. You could edge stitch if you wanted to. It's all nicely enclosed. So this is how I did it. So I've got hasn't had any trimmed off. I've sewn together with the right sides together, the woven or weft, it's sometimes known as, interfacing. It's a fusible interfacing, and I've sewn that along the edge that will become the finished edge on the inside of the facing. So this edge here, this is the edge of the neck and the collar. This will form the part of the under collar. This will be the point of the collar, and this will be the edge of the button bar, so it'll go that way down the front of the shirt. Okay, so this part with the curve will just be loose inside the garment. So that's the bit we want really neat. The other bit will be sewn into a seam allowance. So here I've got the two sewn together. I've done a really narrow hem. It's probably less than an eighth, maybe a little bit more than a 16th. And I'm just run my iron really close to that edge to press that seam nice and flat, but not to put the toe of the iron onto the fusible bit. I'm just going over the cotton lawn bit without going onto the fusible bit. This is the fusible bit, and the fusy adhesive is facing upwards. So I'm getting a nice flat edge there without getting the adhesive on my iron. So you have to be a bit careful. Okay, right, what I'm going to do now is roll this edge. So I want this edge to have I don't see the interfacing from the right side. I just want to see a tiny bit of the cotton lawn. Tiny, maybe 0.5 millimetre of the cotton lawn on the wrong side. I just want it to peek through. So I'm going to just push, just roll that edge with my fingers. So I'm kind of just pressing it with my fingers, and then I'm smoothing out the interfacing. I have excess fabric on the side that I'm going to cut for the seam. So that's the first bit. So I'm pressing from the folded section, just running the iron across to make sure it's pressed down, and then holding the iron down for the recommended amount. Each interfacing has a different amount of time that you have to press the iron down. It's usually 9 to 11 seconds depending on the interfacing. I've got the iron on a wool setting. It's not on a really high cotton setting, or that might just scorch the fabric. Now I'm going to go on to this next bit, and I'm just going to roll this edge again. So I'm just making sure that there's just a little smidgen of the cotton lawn showing on the wrong side, so that if I can see a tiny bit of the cotton lawn on the wrong side, I shouldn't see any of the interfacing on the right side. Just pressing that down. That should give me a really nice edge. You can see the excess fabric I have here. That'll all be trimmed off. This is where I stick it to my ironing board. If this was a rayon, I would be definitely using a pressing cloth, a rayon or a silk or any of those types of fabrics. I'd be using a pressing cloth. I have one here, just handy. So I'd just be going over with my pressing cloth just to give the fabric a little bit of protection from the iron. And as I say, I have it on the moment it's on. Oh, it's not quite on the full, it's halfway between wool and cotton, the setting. There we go, very nice, very pleased with that. So the next step is to put my pattern on there. I can pin that into place and then cut it, because our next stage is just to trim this up. So this is my seam allowance now for my front button band. Don't want to notch my scissors. There we go. Nice, nice, nice. The fact there's brown paper tape all over everything doesn't really bother me anymore. And there we have. So I can now just give this, just run the iron over this to press it. And there it is. Really pleased with that. So you get a very, very tiny step just where the excess fabric from the edge, where you get the seam. It's a little bit darker, but that's all. No interfacing at all showing on the right side, and just a tiny little rollover bit of the cotton lawn showing on the wrong side. And that is how you face a facing. Hello again. Okay, part of the Haskell shirt, which I'm working on at the moment, requires, the hem requires a facing made from bias binding. So I have cut strips 1.5 inches wide from across 45 degrees from the grain line. So if you have a look here, this is the selvage of the fabric. And you can see that my strips have been cut at 45 degrees. I've used my quilting ruler and my rotary cutter. And what I need to do now is to sew roughly a 1/4 inch seam with the bias binding right sides together at 90 degrees. So there we go. So the pieces are at 90 degrees to each other, and the seam is going to go across at 45 degrees here. So I'm going to just put a pin into that so that it'll just hold that in place for now. And I can take that pin out once the seam is being sewn. I'm going to sew along there. I've got my seam allowance about roughly the same at either side, so I need to sew a nice level seam allowance. It's actually probably closer to 3/8 the seam. It doesn't matter how big the seam allowance is, as long as it's the same all the way along. So I need to just make sure I keep that there, and I need to make sure I've got the overlap roughly the same at both ends, so that we know that the seam's going to be straight. Okay, now I'm not going to do a back stitch. I don't usually do a back stitch when I'm sewing bias binding together, but what I am going to do is use a 2 stitch length instead of the standard 2.5 that I would or 3 that I would normally use. So here we go. I'm just going to hold that tail so that that's going to be nice and even. Just going to sew down to the pin. I'll take the pin out before I get there so I don't accidentally break it. And I'm just keeping that straight. Down to the end. There we go. And then use my thread cutter, and that's a nice, reasonably straight seam. That will now be pressed open, and that's the first stage of making the bias binding. And because I've sewn it, it's hard to do on the video, because I'll just press that with my fingers, do a bit of finger pressing. That'll do for now. We'll press it with the iron later, and I will trim off these little ears here. But can you see, doing it at 45 degrees means that I now have a strip of binding, and the next job is to run that through my bias binding maker to create my bias binding, which will be roughly half the width that I have here. Now the bias binding makers, I'll show you one of those in a moment. You can get those very inexpensively. They do a range of different sizes, and you just choose the size of your that you wish to make your bias binding down to. It's single fold bias binding, which is going to look something like that. So both ends turn in. It's a bit tricky to do it on the seam. I'll do it here. Make life a little bit easier for myself. So it's going to be pressed like that. That's how you make your bias binding. You press it like that. Now you can do this just with pins on your ironing board. You can use a fancy electrical bias binding maker, or you could use one of the little binding makers that I think I paid about less than £5 for mine from probably an online, it's probably from Amazon or something like that, less than £5. So, and then if you wanted to make double fold bias binding, it would be folded again, that's double. But that with the two folded in edges is single fold bias binding. That's what we're making today. Okay, so I need to carry on now and attach all my other pieces of fabric, and I've got several here, together like I've done this one, to make a nice long strip, and then any I have left over will just go into my drawer, and I'll have some extra bias binding there ready for any old project that might need a bit of nice polka dot binding. Okay, I'll be back shortly. The next step with the bias binding is to choose which binder you're going to use. Now, on the actual pattern, it just tells you to fold over and just to press one edge and then to stitch that down. But I'm going to make my binding and then and use it as a bias binding because I prefer to do it that way. But you do you. There are lots of different ways to do things. This is just my preferred method. So these are my binding makers, and I've just given that a press so that I can just check which of the binding makers fits my size, and this one, which happens to be the, oh, what's that say, the 18mm one, is about the right size to make my single fold bias binding from an 1.5 inch strip. So how do I use it? If you haven't used it before, we'll move those out of the way. So what we're going to do is to feed the point of the binding into the bias binding maker, and you can use a pin just to help it through. Now it's important that you use a pin that is not going to melt for this job. So I'm using a glass headed pin. There are a number of pins on the market that don't melt, so yeah, I'm not using one of my flower head pins because they would melt. And what this does now, you simply iron over. Helps if your iron's turned on. You simply press the binding as it comes out of the binding maker. And there we have a lovely neat bias binding, single fold bias binding. It's so easy to do, and then we can just move that up and do the next bit. Just put a little bit of tension on. So you can see how you could do this with a couple of pins. You don't have to have a bias binding maker. You can stick a pin onto your ironing board and do it that way. But you know, for the small amount, I think all 4 of these was about £5 or so. They're quite inexpensive and they're really, really useful. So this gives you a really lovely binding that's exactly the same weight and colour as your fabric that you're using for your garment, and it's an ideal way to put a facing on a hem, because the bias of the tape means you can curve and shape the binding without it pulling the hem out of shape. Now we are going to need to go over this bit where the ears are, so I'll just show you how I deal with that. Sometimes it can be a little bit fiddly getting it through the machine. I'm just going to trim that back on both sides so it's flush with the line of the tape. And then I'm going to be very careful as I do that little bit and make sure that it tucks through the bias tape maker. A little bit of tension, tiny bit of tension when you're pressing, not a lot. It will just slide through the bias tape maker. And you need the smallest amount of tension, and then just tuck that in. It should just go through with a nice light fabric like this. It's just going through, and then we'll just check that little bit, make sure it's giving us a good shape. Sometimes you just have to, so the extra thickness there has just caught a little bit, so we can just do that little bit by hand. Just fold it in with our fingers, press it, and it will all be fine. Now you can avoid little bits like that when you're actually using your bias tape. You know, you can cut it, you can join it, so we could take that little bit out. You know, I'll make sure that we use a part of the binding that's a nice shape, and just maybe start or finish our binding by that. And then once I've got a nice length of my binding, I usually get a piece of cardboard and wrap it around a piece of cardboard, a bit of cereal box or something like that, or sometimes I do it around my fingers, and then I pin it together, and that is then ready for use or ready to go into a drawer for me to keep it for another project if I have some left over when I finish doing this one. There we go. I'll just fold that round. So, there we go. So that's my double fold bias binding. I've got lots more to make here, so I'm going to continue with this. I just thought you might like to see how I do it. So I've made my binding. There'll probably be way too much here, but it's always really handy to have some in. I just put a pin through it to hold it in place, or you can put it around card, which works well. So it's a single fold bias tape. If you wanted it double fold, that's double fold, so you just fold it again. But we're working with single fold bias tape. I've trimmed the edge, and I now need to open it up, and I'm going to match this raw edge here. I'm going to put the right sides together with my my hem, and then I'm going to pin it with the raw edges lined up. So this is my shirt hem, this is the facing, and I want to start my binding part way across the facing so that I can finish it nicely when I come to do that. So this is the bottom, and this is the inside of the facing. So I've just turned that inside out again. And I'm going to open up my bias tape, and I'm going to leave myself plenty there that I can finish nicely later. And then I'm just going to start to pin it. Now you can use pins or clips. I'm just going to pin it down, and I shall be sewing this. Let's try and leave the bottom end folded. I'm going to be sewing this with the right sides together and the raw edges together at the top. And I'll be matching the hem with the facing hem, which is for which is half an inch. And we go all the way around the hem doing this. So I will finish doing this and then I'll come back to you. You don't need to see me doing all of this, it'll be very boring for you. So I'll be back in a moment and it'll be all done. So I'm just showing you this little part of the binding. The beauty of the bias binding is this part of the hem is really curved, and if we were going to try to sew it, even if we did a band roll baby hem, it would be really tricky to go on this convex curve one way and the concave curve on the other way. So it's really swoopy, this part of the hem, and the bias tape allows us to use the fact that the bias tape will stretch in different directions and is very, very flexible. That gives us a nice neat facing on the inside of our hem. So I shall finish off pinning it and then come back to you when we sew it together. So that's all pinned on and ready for stitching. So this is right round to the other facing. So I'm going to stitch it not in that ditch there. I'm going to stitch it at the same seam allowance as the facing, which is half an inch. So I'm going to set that up on my machine and then I'll come back to you. So I managed to break my presser foot actually. I don't know what's happening, it's just, I think it's got stood on or squashed or something. And the plastic, this is my favourite 34D presser foot, and it's broken. So very disappointed about that. I'm going to have to buy a new one. So I'm back to my 1D foot, which is okay, it's very similar, but it's just not quite as easy to see what I'm doing. I'm going to just zoom you in. I'll cut that bit out so you don't end up feeling seasick. So I'm working with, I'm keeping this edge here on this line here, which is my 1/4 inch line here, just there. So I'm watching that. I'm going to do a back stitch. I'm using 2.5 stitch length. I'll keep my fingers out of the way. I need to just reverse. And I started on the edge of the facing so that this will tuck under the facing. And I'm just going to sew this along now. Keep the raw edges together. It's very odd sewing through my camera rather than looking at the actual machine. It's a bit weird. Okay, so I shall finish this off and then I will see you in a few seconds. So we're all sewn at half an inch, which is the seam allowance. The pattern now asks us to trim back to 1/4 of an inch, which I'm going to do now. So I'll trim all of that all the way around to 1/4 of an inch and then press it and turn this to the inside, and it'll give us a lovely neat finished hem facing. Understitching the bias tape. So I've pressed the bias tape away from the shirt, stitched on and pressed away. Understitching it to the seam allowance will help it to lie flat. So to do that, we stitch from here through next to the seam along here, all the way around, and we stitched this down to this seam allowance here, just next to that line of stitching. So to do that, I'm going to use my foot number 10, my edge stitch foot, if I can just reach it. I'm going to use my edge stitch foot so that the fin on the bottom of the edge stitch foot will run down the edge of the bias binding, and then I'm going to move my needle to the side so that it stitches in the seam allowance. So I'll move it across by 2 points. So I'll just swap these over. Let's disconnect my drive. Tricky to reach with the camera. There we go. So I shall start just behind the facing. I'm going to run the, you can see there I've got the fin of the edge stitch foot here in this seam line, and then I'm going to move my needle across 2 points so that it will sew just at the side all the way around and attach the bias binding to the seam allowance. So I'll just go nice and steady. I'm smoothing the fabric out as I go to make sure that this fin stays in the centre, in that seam. There we go. Okay. Right, I'll finish that and then I'll come back to you. The bias tape is now understitched to the seam allowance all the way around. And now I need to press it to the inside, press the binding to the inside, and then pin it in place all the way around the hem of the shirt. There shouldn't be any of the binding showing from the right side. So that's the next step. So here we are with it pressed under, and it really is tricky to get it to curve. That's one of the curved sections. And can you see where there's a tiny bit of a fold there? If you put a drop of water on it, just touch it with a wet finger and then press it again, that will come out, that will disappear. I found the side seams getting around this tight corner really tricky, and that, I think that's as neat as it's going to get. I need to just trim off those little bits of fluff there, but it is going to be stitched around there. So yeah, really tricky getting around that section because it's such a tight corner. But the rest's gone round really, really nicely. As I say, a bit of persuasion. So where it was like that with a little crease, I've just dampened it and then pressed it again. You can still see a bit of the crease, but that will lie flat and sew, so that'll be fine. It's fiddly, it's very fiddly, but it does work, and you end up with a really nice, that faces the hem. Now it would be impossible, it'd be really difficult to do a decent hem around a tight curve like that without the bias binding. And the bias binding just, I'll show you a bit that's not got a crease in it. I'll press that one out again, this is better. This did have a crease in it because it's just really tight, but I've just dampened it with my finger and it's pressed out. and that will sew flat, just about. There might be a slight wrinkle in it, but it'll be fine. But compared to if we didn't have the bias binding, it's much, much neater, and you get a really nice edge where it's faced. So that now needs to be sewn. And here we've got the finished top stitch faced hem. That's lovely and neat. You see the understitching and then the top stitching, same on this side. We've sewn that down. No wrinkling on that curve, it's pressed nice and flat. Lovely. All finished.